I actually originally set out to create a talk about how database migrations work behind the scenes, but ended up realizing that I have a lot to learn about Active Record first and created this talk instead. So this is From Confusion to Clarity, Demystifying Active Record in Rails. This is Zoe. She's learning to code and attended a recent Rails Girls event where she went from knowing nothing about Rails to building a web application using Ruby on Rails, all in one day with the help of a mentor. Rails Girls has a really handy guide that Zoe followed, and the code that we'll see today is a result of her time at the event. Rails, Zoe learned, is a web application framework written in Ruby that follows the Model View Controller MVC architecture. It streamlines web development by providing conventions, tools, and a vibrant ecosystem of gems, enabling developers to quickly build and maintain web applications with minimal configuration. Zoe used Rails.new to create the app, and Rails Generate Scaffold to create her a model, view, and controller for her ideas. She was very impressed by how little code she actually needed to write, with Rails magic doing so much for her. By the end of the day, she was really pleased with the website she created to keep track of all her ideas for her dog, Cody. Zoe learned that the data for her ideas was being stored very similarly to a spreadsheet, using columns and rows to arrange the data, and that this was called a relational database. Relational databases, as it turns out, are one of the most popular types of databases. They store and provide access to data points that are related to one another. But Zoe wanted to learn more about how it all worked, how an idea named Make Cody Happy gets from the database to her shiny new website. So she continued her learning and discovered that her database, fresh out of Rails.new, was a SQLite database, and something magical called Active Record was enabling her to interact with the database in her favorite language, Ruby. Active Record, she learned from a quick Google search, comes out of the box with Rails, so it's been there all along, working in the background since she started working on her web app. Neat. To talk about Active Record, she learned, is to talk about object relational mapping, or ORM for short. So Active Record is basically, she understood, a translator. Zoe gets to write her Ruby code to get information from the database, and Active Record does what it needs to do to retrieve that information from the database and send it back to her in a format that she can use. That's a good start, but Zoe wasn't satisfied that that was the full extent of what Active Record could do, and she wasn't satisfied with the out-of-box explanation for Rails either. But she was satisfied with her experience in the console so far. If she wanted to see all the ideas she had in her database, she could use idea.all, and they were displayed in a really nice, user-friendly way. Since she used a variable to store all her ideas, she can find out what its class is, which is an Active Record relation. So already, Active Record is hard at work. And she can do a whole lot more, like count them and add conditional statements using where. Zoe sees all the SQL in her output as well, the dark blue, what her database is responding with to her Ruby code. Certainly, writing Ruby is much simpler, she reflects. Feeling more grateful than ever about Active Record, Zoe sets out to find out how exactly Active Record is set up out of the box with Rails. She identifies 4 main areas in her Rails app to explore: Gemfile, default configuration, database configuration, and model generation. Zoe starts with the Gemfile, feeling like it looks the most straightforward from the list. But before heading to the Gemfile, she wants to confirm what exactly a Ruby gem is. A Ruby gem is code that has been written for a specific purpose that she can use in her work, so she doesn't have to write it all herself. Running Rails.new to create her Rails app has included a lot of gems by default. They're often referred to as a library or package, and Zoe learned that anyone can create a gem and silently commits herself to creating one in the future. RubyGems.org is a site where you can find, install, and publish Ruby gems, just like it says on the website. Satisfied, she goes on to her Gemfile in the Rails Girls application. The first thing Zoe notices in her Gemfile is the source on line 1. This indicates that all the gems should be retrieved from RubyGems.org, the site she was just on. If she needs a gem that isn't on this site, she could specify the site to retrieve it from for that specific gem. She finds the gem Rails and sees that it adheres to semantic versioning, where each version number consists of 3 parts: major, 7, minor, 0, and patch, 4. Zoe ventures back to RubyGems.org site to see what her specific Rails gem looks like. She can see that there are a lot of dependencies, which are gems themselves. When she uses Bundler to install her gems, she can expect an active record gem, version 7.0.4, to be installed, which she would be able to see in gemfile.lock. Gemfile.lock keeps track of all the specific versions of the gems to use in her application. Gemfile.lock is quite overwhelming, but she does a quick search in the file and finds all the places where active record exists. Surprisingly, the version written here is 7.0.8, not 7.0.4. Zoe heads back to the gem file to confirm she's remembering correctly. Yep, 7.0.4, but what she missed before is the tilde and greater than sign. So this means that her app can use any version of Rails that is greater than or equal to 7.0.4 without going to the next minor release, the second number. So 7.0.3 would never appear in her gemfile.lock file. 7.0.8 could, which is what it currently is. And 7.1 would never appear as it's the next minor release. Yep, that explains why the versions are different between Gemfile and Gemfile.lock. Another quick look at Gemfile.lock, and Zoe understands its importance. At the time of creating her Rails Girls app, Rails Gem 7.0.8 was used, and this version was saved in Gemfile.lock. This means that anyone who wants to collaborate with her and runs Bundle will be working up the same Rails version, even if 7.1.0 is available and her collaborator is using it on another app. Neat. Feeling satisfied with her Gemfile learning, Zoe heads back to her list. Next up is default configuration, and for this, Zoe dives into application.rb. Zoe hones in on line 3, require Rails/all. Rails, she learns, is a modular framework composed of various components, and each is responsible for different aspects of web development. These components include active record for database interaction, which is all Zoe is really interested for today, action pack for handling web requests, action mailer for email handling, active support for utility functions and extensions, and also more. Zoe learns that you could in fact omit this line of code and require each of the components individually if you didn't need all of them. But going down that rabbit hole is solidly out of scope for today. Zoe also notices, though, that there is no all file in her Rails application. Turns out you have to go right to the source, the Rails source code that is, to find all.rb. Zoe sees active record on line 7 and decides she's satisfied here for now, but makes a note in her learning to-do list to come back and explore later. So this line requires the active record component. Good to know. The next line indicates that Zoe can, in the gem file, specify different sets of gems for various environment groups. Zoe realizes she never even scrolled down through her gem file and heads back to investigate. She scrolls to the bottom and sees that there are, in fact, 3 groups. A group for development and test, a group for development, and a group for test. These are keywords that Rails has chosen, but she could change these, or add different ones, and group them however she wants. For example, she could create a group for production and development if she had a gem that didn't need to be used in her test environment. Okay, so this line is a dynamic way to load the gems specified in the application's gem file, taking into account the different groups defined for various environments, development, test, and production, in Zoe's case. Using groups in the gem file ensures that only the gems relevant to the current Rails environment are loaded, which reduces unnecessary dependencies and improves performance. This makes sense to Zoe, but has absolutely nothing to do with Rails, or active record rather, so she carries on, determined not to let herself get too sidetracked again. Next, Zoe sees that she's defining her application class within her Rails goals module, and it's inheriting from another class, Rails application. In object-oriented programming, inheritance allows a class to inherit behaviors and attributes from another class, a superclass. By inheriting from Rails application, Zoe's application gains access to all the functionality provided by the Rails framework for managing the application's configuration and behavior. Zoe's already ventured to the Rails source code, so she adds this to her list of things to explore later on. There's a space in this class to load specific configurations, but that doesn't have to do with active record, so she adds load defaults to her learning list as well. Surprised she's already halfway through, Zoe forges on to the next item, database configuration, and heads to database.yml. This file, Zoe learns, is essential for specifying how active records should connect to her database. Similar to the groups in her Gemfile, Zoe sees that this file is also organized into sections for different environments: development, test, and production. But these keywords could be changed. Zoe sees that each environment section contains the configuration settings specific to the environment. There's also a default section, and Zoe sees that all her environments are inheriting their configuration from the default. The only unique attribute is the database name. She learns that line 8 is specifying the database adapter that Active Record should use to connect to the database. Zoe's out-of-the-box Rails setting is using SQLite, but she could come back here and change this if she wanted to use a different one. For example, to use PostgreSQL, she would need the PG gem installed, or if she wanted to use MySQL, she would need the MySQL gem installed. Zoe notices a comment above that indicates she'll need the SQLite gem to be installed to be able to use the SQLite adapter for the database. A quick look back in the gem file confirms that the SQLite gem is included, which makes sense because our app works and this gem is included by default when you run Rails.new. Zoe adds pool and timeout to her explore later list, which is growing, and heads to the database keyword on line 14. In the case of SQLite, the database is stored as a file locally on the file system. The database keyword specifies the path to the SQLite database file. I look to the left, and Zoe does indeed see the mentioned file in the database folder. Neat. Unfortunately, it's not in the right format, apparently, but that doesn't stop her from trying to see what's in it anyways. Not as satisfying as she was hoping for, but Zoe can see some words that she knows are in her idea table, so that's something. She decides that she's too curious not to try to see what's in her database file and figures out how to hack in. At least that's what she imagines herself doing. So Zoe, armed with commands fresh from Google and ChatGPT, changes directory into her DB database folder and starts a SQLite console to dive into development.sql. Once in, she wants to see what's in there, so she writes a command to print all the tables. Interesting. Ideas, makes sense. Schema migrations, she's seen these words before, but AR internal metadata, no idea. Resolving to stay on track-ish, she writes a command in SQL to print all the rows in her ideas table. She reflects that if she was in the Rails console, Active Record would enable her to write idea.all. Way nicer. Yep, those are the names of her ideas, but the formatting isn't great. Satisfied, Zoe moves on to investigate what's in the schema migrations file. Not as exciting as she was expecting, but Zoe does recall seeing this number before. She takes a look at the Active Record migration file that was created when she ran the Rails generate scaffold command and sees that this number is at the beginning of the file name. On closer inspection, Zoe realizes that this is actually a timestamp for when the file was created, year 2023, November 20th, at 12:06 and 20 seconds. Cool. Since there's only one table left, Zoe decides to take a look in AR internal metadata. She writes the command to print its contents and is pretty underwhelmed about the results. She adds AR internal metadata onto her list of things to learn and retreats back to database.yml. Back where she started, Zoe realizes that there's actually nothing specific to Active Record in this file, but she's still satisfied that she learned that the app needs an adapter so the database can talk to Active Record. Last but not least, model generation with a trip to application.rb. Let's review what Zoe did at the Rails Ghost event to create her model. She ran Rails generate scaffold with the table name, then the attribute names and their types. This Rails command created a lot of files for her, including the model, database migration file, and some test files. It also created some other files, but Zoe's already taken a lot of detours on her mission to understand Active Record, so she's not as concerned about them right now. She heads back into the code and starts with her idea class. She did add a couple of validations to this class. She wanted all her ideas to have a name and didn't want to accidentally repeat herself, so she used Active Record's presence and uniqueness validation on the name attribute. Looking at her idea class, she sees that it's inheriting from application record. I look to the left, and Zoe sees that that's the only other file in the models folder. Application record, Zoe learns, is an abstract class, meaning that it will never be called directly, only inherited by other class. For example, Zoe would not be able to do application.all, application record.all in the console in the same way she did idea.all. Application record is the base class for all the models in her app, and it's inheriting from Active Record base. This inheritance is what turns what would be a regular Ruby class into an active record model. In Rails, active record base is the primary class that provides the core functionality for interacting with a relational database. Magic happens here. But where is active record base? It's in the Rails source code. Zoe heads back to the Rails source code and finds base.rb. It's a pretty big file at 338 lines at the time of this screenshot. But when she scrolls down, she sees that it's basically a list of many different files that are included or extended. Interesting. Feeling a bit overwhelmed with the large list, Zoe zooms in at validations, something familiar. She decides to see if she can find where the code is written for the presence validation that she's using in her app. After all, the Rails source code, though seemingly magical and mysterious, is also just code written by humans. Or AI, one can never be too sure these days. Zoe finds the validations.rb file that is included in base.rb and heads there. In validations.rb, Zoe searches for the presence keyword, not wanting to get too sidetracked. She eventually finds it at the end, and it seems this too is being required. I look to the left, and Zoe is able to find presence.rb in the validations folder. Presence.rb is the end of the line. Made it. Zoe reads the comments and finds them quite helpful for understanding how the class works at a very high level, and is surprised at how little code is actually in this class. That was a big old detour, but Zoe is pleased with her increased understanding of the Rails source code. It wasn't as scary as she thought it would be. She adds investigate base.rb in more detail to her very large to-do list and gets back on track. So, a recap on model generation. Zoe used Rails's handy generate scaffold command to create a new model which created all the files she needed, and then some. Then she took a look at her idea class and saw that it was inheriting from application record. When she looked at application record, she saw that it was inheriting from active record base. Then she ventured back into the Rails source code and saw that base.rb includes or extends all the files that bring in the functionality she uses on the daily when working with her models and databases. She could have stopped there. She found the base, literally, for active record. But, being curious, she delved further in, wanting to deepen her understanding of validations, using the validation she's using in her model, and found herself in validations.rb. But she wasn't at the end yet, as in validations.rb, it was requiring the code to use to validate presence. So she ended up in presence.rb, where the magic happens. Zoe is feeling like she has a much better understanding of the role active record is playing in her web application and how it comes out of the box with Rails. In her Gemfile exploration, Zoe learned that Rails is actually a gem that is included in the Gemfile. And, importantly, one of the dependencies of the Rails gem is the active record gem. Then it was in application.rb where require Rails/app loaded all the components required, which includes, most importantly for Zoe, active record. She also saw that her application class inherits from Rails application, which gains access to all the functionality provided by the Rails framework for managing the application's configuration and behavior. In database configuration, Zoe realized that there's nothing specific to active record, but that you do need a database adapter for active record to be able to connect to the database. And finally, in model generation, it was an application record, which inherits from active record base, that turns what would be a regular Ruby class into an active record model. When Zoe investigated active record base in source code, she saw all the logic that is included or extended in the class, and realized that active record is so much more than just a translator between her Ruby code and her SQLite database. This marks the end of Zoe's active record learning, for now. She's excited to spend more time working on her ideas app with her improved understanding of what's happening behind the scenes. She's also got a big old list of items to learn more about that she created on this active record journey. Thanks everyone for listening.